TEPCO's P6 trainers and implementation specialists. And today we're going to talk about the P6 report editor. This is going to be a multi-part video, so watch out for future videos. But today's video is only going to focus on basic cell editing. Before we get started, I also want to mention that our P6 Advanced course here at TEPCO contains a module on the P6 report editor, so if you want some in-depth training on it, you can go to www.tepco.us and look at our training schedule. It is the advanced course, so you'll want to look for that one, and it's offered both days and nights. So I'm in P6 and I'm going to be using a turnaround example file that we have for the oil and gas industry, although what you'll learn in this session can apply to basically any project plan. The first thing I want to show you is that when version 8 came out, they changed the way the toolbars work, and we want to show the report editing toolbar. So you want to right click on any toolbar and you want to turn on the option for reports, which is found right here. That's going to add a toolbar by default. It should show up in the upper left, and we will be utilizing that in the session. Now in the reports toolbar, there's going to be a little drop-down arrow on the right-hand side. Go ahead and click that, and then there's an option to add or remove buttons. And go ahead and turn on the report groups button and the batch reports. That'll ensure that every button in the toolbar is turned on. You'll notice that a majority of the tool buttons in that toolbar are not active at the moment. That's because you have to be in the reports window. So if I click on the reports button over here on the left, now you'll see that some of them become active. And when I click on a specific report, you'll see that they all become active. I'm going to go back to the activities view. And in here I have a project open, and I have it grouped by WBS, only WBS. And I've added the activity ID, activity name, and activity status columns. What I'm going to do is click on the wizard button right here. You can also get here by going to the tools menu, tools drop down, and go to report wizard. And you'll notice, if you haven't used this before, usually if you create a new report in the reports window, it only gives you the option for new report. But because I went there while I was looking in the activities view, I have this option to use the current screen. So we're going to go ahead and select use current screen to get a new report built. Now this session is about using the report editor. You may be wondering, why am I going into the report wizard? I always build the structure of the report first before going to the report editor. You can open the report editor and start with a completely blank page and build your report from scratch. However, I don't really recommend that because you can use the report wizard to do some of the work for you. Or you could copy an existing report which has most of the data components that you want and use that for your new report. So we're going to go through the wizard just to get the structure built, and then we'll get into the report editor and I'll show you how to do some modifications. Here I'm going to click next. I really don't have to do anything here because it's going to be using the current screen, but there is one thing in the report wizard here that I will show you that needs to be changed. The subject areas are fine. If I actually click on the columns button here on the next screen, you'll see that I've got the activity ID, activity name, and activity status. That's what I asked for. I could put a filter on right now if I wanted to. If I had an activities view filter on, it would have applied, so that filter would have shown up in here if I had a filter applied. Click on the group and sort, and you can see that we're grouped and sorted by WBS, and this looks like our typical activities view group and sort window. However, there is an extra field here, show totals. What this does is it automatically defaults to showing totals on the bottom. This is going to subtotal any grouping band that you have, and basically what it does is it adds in extra line items, and we may not want that. So we're going to go ahead, we'll switch it to none for this particular report. That's really the only change you want to make. I may have switched it to top because maybe I want my summary bands to roll the data up. But in this example, we'll switch it to none. And as you're going through the wizard, like I said, this is probably the only change that you would need to focus on if you're using an existing view or layout. And click OK. Next. And we'll call this example number 1. And next. And we'll run the report real quick just so you can see what it looks like. And that's how it's going to look in its native format. And this is what we're going to work with when we get into the report editor. And we'll hit next again, and we're going to click the Save Report button, and it's letting us know it was saved as example 01, and click Finish. Now we're going to go to the Reports view, so this button right here. The report that you create will save into the report group that you were last clicked in. So if you hadn't been into the Reports view since you logged into P6, it typically saves in the first report group. In other words, you may have to go looking for it. To open the report in the editor, there's a few ways you can do this. You can right click on it and click the Modify button, or up in the toolbar there is a Modify Tool button, which is this one right here. So go ahead and click that. If you built the report with a wizard, you're going to get a warning up front that if you modify it in the report editor, if you go back and use the wizard against it, all the modifications that you did are going to be lost. So the rule is once you go in to the modifier or the editor, do not ever go back to the wizard on it, because it's going to undo anything that you do in the report editor. So we'll go ahead and click yes on this. That's what the report looks like in its native format, and this is what the wizard had set up for us. Here's a screenshot of the same type of report, just so you can get an idea of how the fields map over to the actual print preview of the report. So you can see we have the report title at the top, and then you'll see we have the WBS header and the activity ID, activity name, and activity status headers, which are shown here. And then down here where you have the data sources, so this is activities by WBS, which means we're grouping the activities by the WBS. And then the blue area here is the actual activities themselves. So you can see based on the arrows drawn on this screen how the fields relate to the print preview of the report. Back to the report editor, I'm going to go through a few things in here you should probably know. I'm not going to go into detail on them, and they will be covered in future videos that I put out. But there are a few basics that you need to understand before we get moving on with editing cells. First of all, at the top left here are a bunch of tool buttons. The first one creates a new report. So what that's going to do is if I were to click that, it's going to wipe out the current report and make a blank page where you can start from scratch. I mentioned earlier that I don't typically do that. I usually start by using a layout or using the report wizard to get going at first. The next one, this green button, is to add a data source. That tells P6 which tables you want to loop through or go through to pull data back. If you've used the report wizard much, you will notice the first part of the wizard asks for a subject area. The subject area is the same thing as a data source. Next is a row. We have to add rows in order to add cells. So rows are necessary before we can even add the cells, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. This one adds cells, so this is where you actually add what cell you want to put into the report, and then you can identify what data it's supposed to return for you. This one here adds an image. I don't use it very often because there's not a lot of control around the size and so forth of putting images. But you can put background images and things like that in here. I have inserted image cells where it would actually bring back a graph from an Excel file that I have stored off onto another share drive or onto my C drive, but that's not very common for me to do. This adds a line cell, so if we add a row and we want to just run a line across the report to kind of break up some data elements, we can add a line, and we'll be discussing that a little later as well. Here's a print preview. The next one is the properties window, and I'm going to show that to you in a minute. And the next item here is the wizard. So you can actually trigger the wizard to run against this report again if you wanted to change data components by using the wizard. Like I said, you don't want to go into the wizard if you've already kind of built out this report and made some edits to it. Now I want to take your attention down to the lower right corner. You have a help button, a cancel button, and an OK button. It's important to understand that there is not a save button inside the report editor. You have to click OK to save it. When you click OK, it's going to close the report. So I'll go ahead and do that. That will save the report. And you want to do that periodically because there are times when you're working in the report editor, things might lock up on you. So click OK quite a bit and then just right click on it again and go back to modify and start where you were. The other thing is if you make some changes or maybe you damage the report and you don't want to save it, just hit the cancel button in the lower right. That'll ensure that it cancels it, it does not save it, and you can go reopen it again and take off on the last version. There's not an undo button, so hitting cancel is really your undo. You have to back out of it. That's why you want to save it quite a bit, because if you do 10 minutes worth of work inside a report and then you find out you have to cancel it, now you may have just lost 10 minutes worth of your edits. So cancel and OK are very important buttons and should be used frequently. Now we're going to go into editing cells. This may be all that you want to learn. We will have future videos out for more detailed information on using the report editor, including adding data sources and some more advanced concepts. But this video, the remainder of it, may be the only functionality that you need to utilize. In order to edit cells or any data element in here, we need to open the properties window. That's this button right here. But be aware that you can double click anywhere in the report and it will open it as well. So I'm going to double click just on this green data source. And when it opens the properties window, you'll see some tabs at the top here. Because I double clicked on the data source, the source tab showed up. Watch what happens when I click on a cell. It automatically jumps over to the cell tab. If I had a blank row in here, which I do at the top or towards the top, I'll click here and you'll see that it jumps over to the row. And then there's also the furthest tab on the left is general report information. So if I click on there, this is where you can edit the title. You can put in a background image, do some page setup. And this is also where if you're doing time distributed data, where you could set your timescale options. I'll just open that up real quick so you can see that. But timescale start, what the date interval is going to be if you're using a shift calendar, and timescale finish and duration. So very similar to how we set up our timescales when we're working in, say, the activities view or the resource assignments view. You notice when I hit cancel, the report editor has disappeared in the background. It will come back when I close the properties window. So you will have to click on the red X at the top here. And once it comes back, just double click somewhere again and reopen the properties window. Also in the properties window in the report tab, the title, if I change it here, it does not change it in the reports window list. So it currently is named example-01, which is what I saved it as, and that's what it displays as inside the reports list if I were to cancel or click OK and get out of the report editor. But if I do change it here, it no longer is linked to the reports list and vice versa. So keep that in mind. So if you want to change the title to this report, maybe putting a report numbering scheme on the front of it, which I like to do, you may want to copy this field here, and you can just highlight it after you get done editing it. Press Control-C on your keyboard, and then close out, and then go paste the new title into the reports list as well. The other thing here is the viewing options. You'll notice that the width down here is 10.6. Basically, when we ran the wizard on this, the wizard decided how wide our report was going to be, but we usually want to build our reports around what our paper sizes are going to be. So you'll want to know in advance, are you running it in portrait or landscape? Are you doing it in US letter size or A4 size maybe, a different size if you're in Europe possibly? And you want to set this width to whatever you intend on printing it to be. And I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to change it to 8.5 first. Watch what happens to the canvas in the background. It shrinks it up. I actually don't want to do that. I'm going to make this one 11 wide, so it's going to be more of a landscape report. So I punch in 11 there, click enter, and now it stretches it back out. So just be aware, you usually want to set up your canvas size to match whatever you're going to be printing to, because it'll make a little bit more sense, and the width of the report here will reflect what the paper size is that you intend on going to. Now regarding cells, a cell can be identified because you'll see a little blue letter in the top right-hand corner of every cell. Here you'll see one with a C in it that indicates that it's a custom text cell. Up here we have one with a V in it. That's a variable cell, so it's pulling back variable data, which could be things like a date or the data date, the report title, and so forth. And the data cells have a D in them, so those are the ones that are actually pulling back data from the data tables. Data cells exist underneath or within data sources. You'll see here we have a data source, which is activities by WBS, and then we have a cell which says WBS name. That's actually the grouping band for WBS. So if we do a print preview, that's the WBS grouping bands right here that it's pulling back. And then the next data source are activities. So once it sets up the groupings for the WBS bands, then it actually brings back the activities. So that's these here. You can add more data sources. That's going to be covered in future videos, but I'll just give you one example right here. I could add a data source underneath activities. It comes in as orange at first, but I have to tell it what I want it to loop through. So I hit this drop down and I can say loop through activity resource assignments. And then I would have to add a row and some cells here. And what that would do is it would cause the activities to all be listed underneath each WBS element, but then it would show underneath each activity the resources that are assigned to it. And there's multiple data sources that you can add underneath activities. So if I was using activity steps or expenses, I could put in predecessors or successors. It's the kind of things that you would find in the activities detail tabs if you were working in the activities view. Now I need to remove this data source, so I could simply hit cancel, but I'm going to lose my other changes that I made, including the page size or the canvas size that we had set up to 11 inches previously. I can click on the data source here, which is now yellow, but if I hit the delete button on my keyboard or I right click and say delete, it doesn't allow me to delete it. I need to select the entire data source, all of the yellow, and there's only one way to do that. That's to hit escape on your keyboard while you're clicked inside it. So I click anywhere inside the yellow, whether it's the data source header area, detail area, or the footer area, and I hit escape on my keyboard. When I hit escape, you can barely see it, but it actually backed out or selected the entire data source. Now I can press delete on my keyboard, and it'll ask me if I'm sure that I want to delete that component, and I can say yes, and it goes away. Now you'll notice I have a lot of space here. If I want to tighten that up, the quickest way to do it is to right click and select auto arrange. And that I use frequently. It just helps clean things up every once in a while. If things have spread out, I can right click and say auto arrange and it'll tighten everything back up. In a minute, I'll be showing you how to use the escape key to delete rows, so it comes in handy in other areas. For example, I could click on this cell right here, and if I hit escape on my keyboard, it steps backwards and it actually selects the row that the cells reside in. So now if I hit delete, I would actually be deleting the entire row, including the cells inside of it. If I hit escape again, it jumps back again, but it only grabs the detail area of the next data source. So I have to hit escape again. Now it highlights the entire data source. If I hit delete right now, the data source, the blue, is going to go away along with the row and the cells inside of it. If I hit escape again, it jumps back again. Now I've selected the detail area of the green data source, or the data source where the activities are grouped by WBS. If I hit escape one more time, I've selected the entire green data source. If I hit delete right now, I'm going to delete the green data source along with everything that resides in it, which includes the WBS name. It also includes the activities data source, plus the row and the activity ID, activity name, and activity status inside there. So basically, I'm going to delete everything if I were to hit the delete button on my keyboard right now. For the remainder of the session, we're going to clean up this report and make it look better. There's quite a few things we can do to make it look much more professional. First of all, any report that you create is going to have this field up here called Notes. I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to go back to the Reports view, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to say Run, and I'll say Run Report. This field down here is the Notes field, and if I type anything in there and then do a print preview, it is going to show those at the top of the report. I don't ever use this, so if you do use it, you should not remove this field, but I'm going to remove the field. So we're going to right click, go back to modify. This is wasting space. Now, that is a cell. I can hit delete right now and delete the entire cell, but the row that the cell resides in is still going to stay there. So if I hit delete, it's going to ask me if I want to delete this report component. I say yes, but you'll notice that the row is still there. That's still going to waste space at the top for me. So I actually want to get rid of the row as well. But I'm going to do that over and show you what I normally do. And I'm going to say no, I don't want to save the changes. I will reopen the report. When I click on the notes cell, I'm going to hit escape on my keyboard. Remember, that jumps back. So it's going to jump back and grab the row behind the cell, because I actually don't have any room to click the row itself. Down here I do, and I'll show you that next. So right now I have the row selected. I'm going to press delete on my keyboard, and yes, now that one goes away. This next one is just a blank row. That's wasting space on my header as well, so I'm going to delete that. Now on these, I don't really need the WBS here because it's pretty much implied. Anybody that's looking at the report probably knows that it's grouped by the WBS. Sometimes I will put in an indicator at the top here as to what my grouping bands are, but for this case we're going to remove this and save some more space. So we're going to go ahead and now we can just click the row because we can get at it. The cell isn't fully covering the row. If I actually grabbed the edge of the cell and stretched it over, it would cover the whole row and I wouldn't be able to get at it. So we'll go ahead and move that back. I click the entire row and the WBS is going to go away. Now remember, that's just the WBS header, so if I print preview, you'll notice that it's not showing the letters WBS up here anymore, whereas previously it was. And you can see that we've really tightened up the header space here. Next, we're going to talk about how to kind of clean up the cells or maybe change the size of the columns in order to accommodate the data a little bit better. First of all, if you click on a cell, you can click and drag it right or left. Typically, there is one caveat to that, and that's if I double click here and I open up the properties window. Underneath the cell tab, there is an align cell drop down here, and you can either align it to center, left, right, or none. By default, when you create a report with the wizard, they are all aligned with none. So you can grab them and move them around. They're basically floating. Now what I like to do is I will click on, say, the activity ID header up here, and I'm going to align the cell on that to the left. What that does is it pushes the cell as far left as it can. Now if I click on activity name and I say align cell to the left, it goes as far left as it can before it bumps into the next left aligned cell. Now if the activity ID was not aligned left and it was still floating or set to none, the activity name would have actually overridden that and it would have shoved over the top of it or underneath it. So be aware that that can happen. What I usually like to do is I like to figure out which cells do I want pushed to the left and which ones do I want pushed to the right, because what happens is when the report editor builds a report, it leaves a little bit of space in between the cells. If you're using a lot of columns, that can be a lot of space. You could actually have another column or two worth of real estate there to work with. So usually what I do is I figure out which columns are going to be pushed to the left. So activity ID, we've already identified it and pushed it to the left by using the align cell. Next, I'm going to go to activity status, and I'm going to push this one to the right. So I'm going to go align cell right. That one pushes it all the way over to the right. Now I'm going to go in and fill in the space. I could grab the edge of activity name and I could drag it over. You can also manually change the width by changing the width right here. But if I really just want everything to be clean and to fill in all the space, I can click on activity name and I can tell it to align the cell to center. That's going to utilize whatever space it has available. The other thing is if I copy this cell, and you can copy cells, and then I paste it right where it's at, it's going to insert another cell. And when it does that, the cell is actually aligned right still, But the activity name, since that one was aligned to center, it compensated for the insert. So the activity name shortened up in order to fit the new cell in there. And then of course, once I get that in there, I could say what the header title is supposed to be, like finish date possibly. And if I remove the cell, I just have to click on it, press delete on my keyboard, say yes, and you'll notice that the activity name recompensated. Now, since the cell has been taken out, the activity name has kind of stretched out to fill in that space again. Anything I do to the header cells, I need to do to the corresponding data cells. Otherwise, they'll be out of alignment. You can start to see here, activity ID, activity name, my activity status is not in alignment. So I have to do the exact same thing down to the corresponding data cells. So I'm going to click on activity ID down here, align cell left. I'm going to click activity status, align cell right. And I can see that activity name may be overlapped with my ID a little bit, so I'm going to move that over a little bit before I actually center it, just to make sure it doesn't accidentally overlap the activity ID, and we'll go align cell center. By the way, whatever cell you choose to align center, the one that you want to use to flex or expand or contract to compensate for space, either by adding a new cell or by removing a cell, this is the cell that you want to expand and contract. Set that one to center last. Make sure that you set your other cells to left or right first so that they push to the left or right, and always center the field that you decide you want to be flexible. Set that one to center last. Once I've aligned the cells center, left, or right, the next thing I need to look at is the width of the cells. Now, if I click on the activity ID column header and I look at the width, that says 1.39 over here. If I click on activity ID, the data cell, you'll notice that that says 1.59. So the fields are actually still a little bit out of sync because this cell is a little bit larger than its corresponding header. So what I need to do is make sure that they're running at the same width. Activity IDs I usually run at about 1.2. So what I do is I click on both of them. First I'll click on the header. I come down here to the width and I'm going to type in 1.2 and I'm going to hit enter. By the way, when I hit enter, watch what happens to the activity name field next to it. It compensates for it. So I've shortened the cell up. The cell that is centered, which is the activity name, that one will expand. So we go down to the activity ID data cell, also make that 1.2. Enter on my keyboard. Now everything is in alignment. And I usually try to check all of the cells to make sure that they're the same. But usually the one on the left, the activity ID, they tend to come in with different widths on them due to how the wizard created them in the first place. I'm going to do a quick print preview so we can see where we're at on it, and then I'm going to click OK to close it to ensure that it saves, and then I'll reopen it. So print preview. So far we have cleaned up the top. We have also realigned the headers, and we've realigned the activity data down below here. The next thing I want to show you when we come back in is the activity ID here, how it's indented. I can show you a way to resolve that if you don't like having the ID indented. And you'll notice that when it is indented, it is actually eating up the space. We set it up to be a 1.2 inch width, but because it's putting an indent on it, it's eating up some space at the front end of that on the left side of the cell, which could actually cause your activity IDs, the tail end on the right-hand side, to be hidden. So you want to make sure that that doesn't happen. And we'll go ahead and close print preview, and I'm going to click OK, and then right-click and click Modify again. Now regarding the activity ID, I'm going to double-click on it, which is going to open my Properties window and take me to the Cell tab. Down at the bottom, there is a checkbox here for Indent Cell. Some of the cells are indented, some of them are not. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off, and I'll show you what the results are by going to Print Preview again. Now it's actually pushed all of my IDs out to the left. So it's really your preference. If you do like them indented, that's great. Just be aware that you're eating up more space. So if you're trying to fit more data inside a row or a line item there, you may want to actually outdent those or take the indent off so that you are saving some more space. Next, let's format the WBS grouping bands. So the cell name here, WBS name, that's what we're going to be working with. I'm going to double click it. But before I do this, I want to take us over to the data source. So I'm going to click on the green because that's the WBS data source to group the activities by WBS. And here we have loop through, so that's identifying what we're looping through, what we're going to group by. You also have page break options, and then you have some options here for organizing hierarchically, hide if empty, and so forth. So this is very much like the group and sort that we work with when we're in the activities view. I'm going to take off the organize hierarchically because I don't want my WBS in this particular report to be organized hierarchically, in other words, indented. So if I look at it now, you'll see that the WBSs are all outdented and not indented hierarchically. You may not like that. It's your preference. I tend to do that because of what I'm about to do next. I'm going to color and put a border around this cell. First of all, this cell is not filling up the entire page. There's a bunch of blank space over on the right-hand side. I'll show you what it looks like first. I'm going to put borders on it. So I click on the cell, and I'm going to come down to this borders button. I'm going to put a left border, right border, top border, and bottom border on, all the way around. Now we'll print preview, and that's what that looks like. But you'll see right here that it's not filling in the entire page, so we'll fix that next. And that's basically by going to the Cell tab and telling it to align the cell to center, which is going to take that one cell and fill in the entire space. Print preview again. And this is why I'm not going to put the hierarchical on, is because I really don't want to see the parent elements in there. I just want this to be straightforward. You'll see as I scroll down that it gets a little messy here and there. So I'm going to go ahead, double click the green again, which will bring me to the data source tab. And I'm going to make it so that's not hierarchical. I'm also going to turn on hide if empty. And when I turned on the hide if empty, that took the parent elements out. So the hierarchical up the level parents have been removed because I turned on the hide if empty. So now that looks a little bit more clean. And eventually when I run this report, I'll put a filter on it. So I'm probably only wanting to see a specific job inside this project file. Next, I want to color the cell. So I'm just going to click on the WBS name again. It's going to bring me to the Cell tab. The color is controlled right here. There's a color button. Click on this button right here and it will open up a palette of colors for you. Go ahead and select green for this one. Print preview. And that's what it looks like now. While we're here, I want to point out a little bit of a problem that kind of varies depending on which version of P6 you're using. I'm currently using 16.2 with Service Pack 6 for this video. Notice how this is actually the WBS code, but I wanted the WBS name. If I double click on here, it says WBS name, and even if I switch it to code and then switch it back, it still won't correct itself. And like I mentioned, the different versions seem to act differently around this. Unfortunately, what I would have to do to fix this is I would have to run the wizard against it. And we'll go use current screen. And I'd have to come into group and sort. And the mistake I made here was when I initially came through the wizard and at the group and sort window, ID code was on instead of name and description. Now if I continue through the wizard here, I'm going to lose all my formatting and I'm going to have to start over. So I'm just going to live with the WBS code for now, but I wanted to make that point in case you run into this. It could trigger you to actually restart the wizard and start it all over. So I have the properties window open here, and I just want to do a quick review of all of the fields inside the cell tab. First one is the cell type. I mentioned that in each one of the cells you'll see a little blue letter in the top right hand corner. That's controlled by this, so we have 4 types of data. We have custom text, field data, field titles, and variables. Field titles actually bring back the column titles from the database, and usually I use custom text because I want to modify them or just type the titles in manually. So field title is one that I don't use very often. Variable brings back things like the current date, the data date, the project name, and so forth, and I'll be covering those in future videos. And mainly what we're working with now is field data. Once you get the cell type selected, there's a cell object. This is where you can actually go in and change the table that P6 is pointed to. Now the source tab actually controls the source that it's pulling from, but you can actually do some assignments here, or you can change the parameters here, which opens up the door to some other things. And I don't want to go into details on this because that could take an entire new video, but I just wanted to point that out. It came over as WBS because that's what we had selected as our subject area. In a future video, I will describe how you can make changes to that to make some cell modifications that you actually cannot do in the activities view. There are certain things you can do in the report editor that you can't do anywhere else in P6. The cell field is the actual column or data field that you want to use. So these pretty much match what you would see in your activities view in this case, depending on the subject area. So if we had used a data source or a subject area of activity resource assignments, these fields would be different. But this is basically the area where you select what you want in the field. So this is the primary one that you would change or modify for new reports. Align the cell center, so we can align the cell left, right, or center, or you can tell it none. If you set it to none, it's just going to be a floating cell, and you can actually click and drag it and move it around. I like to shuffle things to the left or to the right and then center one of the cells to fill in the space. Things tend to turn out cleaner that way. If I left everything as none and I tried to manually move things to the positions that I want, I'd have to watch the ruler up on top, and sometimes your column titles can get quite out of sync with the data below. So you want to be careful with how you're handling this. Text alignment. So do I want the text left or right? So if I just click on one here, this is just like Excel. So I could right justify the text, which would move it over to the right of the cell. I could center it. And in a lot of cases, I do center some of the fields. For that one, we'll leave it as left justified. Font style, we have body font 1. We have a bunch of fonts in here that are already pre-made. Body font 1, body font 2, I use those a lot. The difference between those two in particular is just that body font 2 is bolded, but it's actually the same font. But anytime I want to change a font, I'll go ahead and do that on WBS name here. I usually come in and go to Customize, and then click on this button here that says Custom Font. Now I can do a lot of different things with that font. So I could increase the font size, and I could change the color of it. And that's what that would look like. Not very pretty, but we'll leave it for now. Now down below here, timescale type. If you are using time distributed data, doing a spreadsheet, the cells that can be time distributed, if you select one of them, this will become active, and I'll be making another video specifically on time distributed data. But just be aware, if it is a cell that can be time distributed, you can change that here, whether you want it to be the period total or the intervals, the same types of things that you would go through if you had selected time distributed data in the wizard. Format cell text. This one is interesting. Let's say that you're building a report and your user preferences are not showing any of the labels for hours or days. But if you build this report and the format cell text checkbox is turned on, if someone else runs the report, it will look at their user preferences and it will put in the H's or the D's. Maybe you don't want to do that, and you want to make sure that that can never happen to the report, especially if you're building a report that you intend on pushing to Excel as an ASCII text file. You wouldn't want anybody to run the report and have the H's or the D's on, because that will cause Excel to read them as text cells rather than number cells. So if you want to make sure that there is no formatting allowed on a cell, you can take this checkbox off. Of course, this is WBS name, so there's not really anything there that would be affected anyway. Now regarding Indent Cell, we had talked about that earlier. You can indent cells, and when you use the wizard, they will indent automatically. That'll also happen if you set up multiple grouping bands in the group and sort window, because it will indent the second, third, and fourth grouping bands and so on. So you can tell P6 if you want the cell indented or not, and the difference is this. Now they're indented, but I like to save real estate unless it makes sense, and depending on who I'm running the report for, I usually won't indent cells, but sometimes you need to do that just to make it clean so that if they're looking at a large amount of data, it's a little cleaner to look at. Other thing is borders. I'm going to go ahead and put some borders around all of these activities. Now the activity ID is what I'm selected on right now. I'm going to put a left border, top, and bottom. For activity name, and you have to do these one by one. You can't select a bunch of cells and put borders on all of them at the same time like you could in a tool like Excel. I'm going to put a top and bottom here. And then on activity status, I'm going to put a top, bottom, and right border. And if we look at that, now I actually have all my activities grouped together. I probably wouldn't do that in this sort of report, but I'm going to give you an example of another report here in a few minutes where I would do this. Filters, I don't usually use filters on cells. It's a little difficult to understand them, but basically you can tell it, if it's say an activity code, you can tell it to only show the cell value if it is equal to one of the codes in the system. Sometimes you can go in here thinking that you're putting on a filter and it doesn't actually do anything. So it's a little more subtle. I've never really found a reason to use a filter in this view. Your filtering for the entire report is done in the source tab. So you'd want to click on usually the most outer source, and you click on edit filter, and this would be the same type of filter that you would have in your activities view. And HTML links, you can put HTML links into cells in here. The only thing is that we usually print reports to hard copies, so hot links really aren't going to matter. I believe the intent here was that if you were running the report out to HTML, you could hot link some of the cells to different documents or so forth. I've never really used that either, but it is there, and you could go ahead and try that out if you feel like you have a need for it. Before we finish up this video, I'm going to show you a bit of a more elaborate report. I have a turnaround schedule open, a refinery turnaround schedule, and I want to create a report that is a job scope report. So the intent will be that we can put a filter on this report and run a scope for one of the particular WBS elements. This could be useful for job walks or just to let the team know what's involved with doing the job. So I ran it in the wizard first, and I'm going to show you what that looks like in the editor. This report was built in the wizard. I grouped it by project and then by an activity code called TA equipment type, and then the WBS element, that's where the job resides. I've also grouped after that by what's called TA phase. So it's a turnaround phase. I'm going to filter for the execution phase only. And then I'm going to list the activities, and underneath each activity I'm going to have the resource assignments. I'm going to have predecessors. I've actually added successors to the final report as well, but when I ran the wizard I only selected predecessors. And project expenses. So if you're doing cost in P6 and you put an expense item on that particular job or activity, it would show up here. I'm going to take a screenshot of this just so we can reference it later. And you can see that the grouping bands have not spread across the entire report, so there's a lot of things that we need to fix here. We have a lot of open space up here being utilized. This really isn't necessary. This is going to land at the top of every page, so this is really a waste of space right here, so we're going to clean that up. We need to take the column headers and move them left and right, spread them out, resize them. And along with the column header resizing and moving around, we have to resize the activity IDs, the activity name, the information down under the activity here, because that needs to match whatever we do to the column headers. And down under the sub data sources, so the activity resource assignments, the predecessors, and expenses, each one of those has columns and some data fields in them as well, so we have to adjust those, move them around to make it look cleaner. When we get to the final report as well, I want to note that I've added another data source, which is going to be a WBS notebook topic. This is to show any information inside an assigned WBS notebook item, which is going to be used towards the top of the report to give any additional text information or a narrative on what the scope and the description of the job will be. I'm going to run this report in its native format so you can see what it looks like by just using the wizard. And you can see that's kind of sloppy. So The whole intent of going into the editor is to clean this up and make it presentable. I also want to point out at the top this WBS element where it says E321. I am pulling in the summary data for that, like the original duration, budgeted labor units, and so forth, but I really only want the at completion total cost. So in the final report, I've cleaned these cells out. Basically, the concept is that they don't need that information at a summary level, but they do want to see what the total cost is going to be. Okay, I'm going to close this report, and we'll go and open the final one. And I'm going to split my screen here so you can kind of see the original one versus the modified final version. So you can see at the top of the report I have cleaned out. I've deleted all of the elements up there, all of the rows that were unnecessary. You can see that my activities by project grouping, I've changed the color. I've done that to all of the grouping bands. This element right here is the notebook item. And this is the WBS notebook item I mentioned. I added this data source afterwards because the wizard would not allow me to do it with the type of subject area that I had selected in the wizard. And I've cleaned up the headers and the activity information. I've also added some headers for resource assignments, the relationships, and also a little lower one for expense items. And I've cleaned up each of these data elements. So I've moved the column data around, shuffled it left or right, and centered it, and so forth in order to make it a bit more presentable. So let's print preview this one, and here's what that looks like. I did put in a logo for TEPCO on the top here, and this is all done in the header area of the report editor, and that will be discussed in more detail in a future video. I put in generated by, and this actually draws in the username. I'm logged in as admin right now, but in your environment, if you had usernames in there, you could have them displayed at the top right of the report. I find that very useful because if someone comes up to me and says, "Hey Dan, can you run this report for me?" If I've never seen it before, but it has a username at the top for the person that did last run it, I can go talk to them and get some information on the report, find out where it's at. Also put the run date and time. And like I said, we've cleaned up and moved around the headers. I made sure that my activity information, which is right down here, matched it. So when you move things left, I moved the activity ID, the cell to push to the left. I moved all the other cells to push to the right, and then I used the activity name as a centering one, so that's the one that flexes to fill in any space. Here's the header band that I added for resource assignments, and then here's the resource assignment information. I changed the names of these headers to make more sense for this particular industry, and you can see the resources here along with the crew size, durations, and total hours. Next we have the relationships, so I brought in the relationships. I did add a little cell here just to indent them. I thought that looked a bit cleaner. But these are the predecessors here, and I've included information on the duration, if there's any lag on the relationship, and if it's a driving relationship. So any type of other column data that you wanted to put in there for relationships, you certainly could. And the same thing for successors. And on this particular activity for installing the blinds, I did enter a mock expense item for exchanger blinds. I didn't put a cost on it. If you have an expense item, it will show up. I colored it blue to draw some attention to it if an expense item shows up, because not all activities have expense items. So if I scroll down here, I do have another one right here that does have a cost on it. I mentioned also that I added the data source for the WBS notebook item, and that's right here. So at the top, we have the job, or the WBS, which is going to be this exchanger. Here's an overall scope description for it, so I just mocked up some text to put in there for the time being. But if you had a job letter, maybe some data from SAP or something like that that you wanted to paste in there, you certainly could. It's also grouped by phase, so anything underneath this grouping band is part of the turnaround execution phase. And you'll also notice that this particular code for safety, I colored it red, so whenever it shows up, because the safety code is not on every activity, so when it does show up, it is red, just to draw some more attention to it. So we initially started with the report in the wizard, and this is what the wizard gave us, and we ended up with this report when we went into the editor. And keep in mind, Probably 90% of the work getting the report to look like this had to do with moving cells around, the stuff that we've been talking about during this video. So that's most of the work. Adding the data source, we'll be talking about that in a future video, and a few other tips and tricks, including adjusting the headers and footers and so forth. Just keep in mind, if you can work with the cells and moving the cells around and coloring them, putting borders on them, positioning them, and resizing them, that may be all you need to make your reports look brilliant. Thanks for watching today. If you need any cost or schedule support or implementation support or training, please go to www.tepco.us.